Imagine throwing a house party, but only for people who won't arrive empty-handed, squat on your couch, and empty your fridge. That's pretty much the idea behind the Copenhagen criteria. Since the early 90s, these rules have decided who gets to join the European Union and who doesn't. Today, we're unpacking the logic behind the EU's membership conditions, the rules themselves, and the problems of the system. Welcome to Ciceroni. Want to help us explain other complex aspects of the EU? You can support us by becoming a patron. Every euro helps. After the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, Europe found itself at a crossroads. Dozens of countries from the former Eastern Bloc were suddenly looking west, not just geographically, but politically. Everyone wanted in on the EU's promise of peace, prosperity, and passport-free travel. But there was a problem. Not every country was ready. Some lacked basic democratic institutions. Others had economies held together by chewing gum and nostalgia. The EU needed a filter, not to exclude, but to prepare countries for EU membership. Enter the Copenhagen criteria. Set in 1993 at a summit in Copenhagen, these criteria were designed to ensure new members wouldn't just benefit from the EU, but also uphold its values. Think of them as a safety net to protect both the applicant countries and the EU itself from chaos, corruption, or collapse. When people talk about the Copenhagen criteria, they sometimes picture a few neat boxes to tick. But don't be fooled, it is a long list of very complex requirements. All of this complexity starts with a rather simple requirement. According to Article 49 of the Treaty on European Union, any European state can apply that respects and promotes democracy, the rule of law, human rights, and minority protections. While you might have missed it, the European here is very important. For example, when Morocco applied in the 1980s, the EU denied its application simply because it wasn't considered European under the treaty. For those who do check the box of being European, the journey begins into the long list of criteria. These are divided into three main chapters. Joining the EU means signing up for more than shared trade and travel. You're committing to liberal democracy in full, free elections, independent courts, a functioning parliament, and protection of human rights and minorities. And crucially, you must demonstrate these aren't just promises, but actual practice. Take Estonia, for example. In the 90s, fresh out of Soviet rule, it was still shaking off authoritarian dust. But within a decade, it didn't just hold elections, it built a digital democracy so transparent and effective that Western European countries still consider it a best practice they are trying to copy. And when concerns about minority rights arose, especially concerning Russian speakers, Estonia worked with EU partners to improve integration without compromising core values. Result? A green light to join. Compare that to what's happened inside the EU's own walls, and highlight a big problem the EU did not properly consider. Hungary met all the democratic standards when it joined in 2004. But over time, as media freedom shrank and judicial independence was weakened, the EU realized having criteria for entry is one thing, having tools to uphold them post-entry is another. Budapest taught Brussels a hard lesson. Democracy isn't a one-time install. It needs constant updates. This is the main problem of the Copenhagen criteria. Once you're in, you're in. Now, there are some things the EU can do against member states that misbehave, but these tools remain very weak. So countries now applying to be members have to adhere to tests some existing members wouldn't remotely pass. The EU economy isn't just simple trade, it's a tightly woven single market. One country's economy strongly influences the others and they all have full access to the internal market. So it is no surprise that before joining, countries need to prove they've got a functioning market economy and the resilience to swim in competitive waters without sinking, and that it won't suddenly collapse and drag the others down with it. In Poland during the 90s, the economy was in freefall, crippled by decades of central planning. What followed was a brutal but transformative overhaul, the shock therapy reforms. Within years, Poland had privatized its behemoth state enterprises, tamed inflation, stabilized the zloty, and made itself investment ready. By 2004, it wasn't just functioning, it was flourishing. Poland joined the EU with one of the strongest growth trajectories of any new member. But not every country could pivot that fast. Bosnia and Herzegovina, still scarred from conflict and tangled in a complex web of ethnic power sharing, found itself stuck. Without a unified economic vision or decisive reforms, its market remains sluggish, unemployment stubbornly high, and investment patchy. A functioning economy isn't just numbers on a page, it's institutions, infrastructure, and public trust. All of this can take a long time to build properly. The good news? In March 2024, EU leaders agreed to open accession negotiations with Bosnia and Herzegovina, a big step for the country that wants to join as soon as possible. The final hurdle? The acquis communautaire, a fancy French term for all the EU's rules and regulations. From labor laws to environmental standards, data protection to fisheries quotas, it's a sprawling, complex rulebook with well above 100,000 pages. Candidates must not only pass laws to match the acquis, they have to prove they can implement and enforce them. Sounds complex and daunting, but very understandable. You don't want countries to join that have completely different rules for business when joining the single market. Croatia's journey is a perfect example. Progress was steady until Brussels slammed the brakes in March 2005. At first, because Croatia was not fully cooperating with the UN War Crimes Tribunal in The Hague. Later, a border spat with Slovenia also blocked the road. And after that, the EU pointed out some needed internal reforms, cleaning up the judiciary and tackling corruption head-on. Painful changes, yes, but Croatia didn't give up, and by 2013 they joined. Others weren't so lucky. Turkey's negotiations have been frozen for years. Some chapters, like freedom of expression or judicial reform, remain unopened. Not because Turkey lacks capacity, but because it increasingly lacks the political will to improve it. And just when you thought you'd reached the end of the checklist, there's also an unofficial fourth hurdle, added in Madrid in 1995. This is about having the actual administrative capacity to make EU rules work in practice. Passing laws is one thing, having enough competent judges, inspectors and regulators to enforce them is another. Without this, the acquis communautaire is just thousands of pages of very expensive wallpaper. Now, it's one thing to have all of this to adhere to, but how does the EU actually check if a country ticked all the boxes? For this, there is a thorough, multi-stage evaluation process, and Brussels takes its gatekeeping role seriously. Mostly. So how does it work? Every year, the European Commission publishes detailed progress reports on each candidate country. These are no-nonsense evaluations that cover everything from judicial independence to how well trains run. They're drafted by Commission experts with input from embassies, a civil society, and independent observers. Think of it like a school report. One country might get a good grade, while another gets a bad one. Apart from these overall reports, the EU checks every single requirement in detail. Rather than doing one big test at the end when all has been done, the EU breaks the process into 35 thematic chapters, bundled into 6 clusters. Each chapter covers a different domain: environment, consumer protection, fisheries, monetary policy, and everything else. The bundle with the all-important fundamentals, rule of law, human rights, and the judiciary is opened first and closes last. A clever way to make sure the boring-sounding but democracy-saving reforms are locked in before anyone can start popping the champagne. The rules on these chapters are strict. You can't just go back and forth in these as you please. For example, you can't open a chapter until the EU says you're ready. You can't close it until they say you've nailed it. And if you cheat, backslide or fudge the numbers. The chapter can be reopened, delayed, or frozen altogether. Turkey, for instance, opened many chapters early on, but as concerns about press freedom and authoritarian tendencies grew, several chapters were frozen and have stayed that way for years. Since 2018, the entire process has effectively been at a standstill. Besides all these requirements on the applying country, there is one that the EU must check itself. Because it's not just about whether a country is ready to join, it's also about whether the EU is ready to take it in. This so-called capacity to absorb new members means Brussels has to be sure that adding a new country won't break the budget, slow decision-making even more, or overload the institutions. But it's not only about ticking these boxes. Politics always finds a way in. Even with all the chapters perfectly done, EU member states must still unanimously agree to let a new country join. So if your reforms are great, but you've got a dispute with a current member, that might make things harder. Ask North Macedonia. For years it was blocked, not by Brussels, but by Athens over the country's name. Even after changing its name to resolve the dispute, Bulgaria later stepped in with its own objections. Sometimes politics can be so simple. To keep countries motivated, the EU offers pre-accession funds, trade benefits, and support programs for countries trying to become an EU member. But it's not all smiles and subsidies. If a country regresses on media freedom, minority rights, or judicial independence, funding can be frozen and negotiations delayed, or, in extreme cases, halted entirely. Even for countries already in, like Hungary and Poland, the EU has started linking funds to respect for the rule of law, freezing billions for Hungary and holding back money from Poland until reforms were made. It's still a new tool, but one the Commission seems increasingly willing to use in order to combat backsliding after countries have joined. So, the Copenhagen criteria. On paper, they're just 3 sets of requirements. But in reality, they're the EU's promise to itself and to the world. A promise that its doors are open, but only to those who share its values. That democracy isn't just a system of government, but a commitment to transparency, equality, and accountability. And that rules, no matter how boring they seem, are what hold the entire project together. Over the years, these criteria have guided post-Soviet transitions, spurred constitutional reforms, and given entire generations a sense of belonging in the European story. But they've also exposed cracks in the system, revealing how fragile progress can be and how political games can sometimes trump idealism and pragmatism. Still, for all its flaws, the Copenhagen criteria remain one of the most powerful forces for reform on the continent. They're not perfect, but they are principled. And in a world where values are often traded for convenience, that still means something. So the next time you hear that a country wants to join the EU, remember, it's not just about flags and funding. It's about democracy, law, and the long hard work of building a better society. If you enjoyed this video and would like to learn more about the EU's institutions, their functions, and how laws are made, be sure to check out our other videos and subscribe to our channel.